Presidents, a 2-hour video call, and a frank discussion about red lines and consequences. President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke today for the first time since July. Not a ton of pleasantries. Really, this was time for plain speaking. As Western nations see Russia building up troops on the Ukrainian border, President Biden is trying to persuade Putin the cost would be too great if they do an invasion for him, for his country. After the meeting, the National Security Advisor said this.
President Biden was direct and straightforward with President Putin, as he always is. He reiterated America's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He told President Putin directly that if Russia further invades Ukraine, the United States and our European allies would respond with strong economic measures. We would provide additional defensive materiel to the Ukrainians above and beyond that which we are already providing. And we would fortify our NATO allies on the eastern flank with additional capabilities in response to such an escalation.
In other words, this was no run-of-the-mill 11 a.m. Zoom call. This matters. Let's bring in Newsy national security correspondent Sasha Ingber tonight from the D.C. newsroom. Sasha, the dynamics were sort of hard to discern. We just had this picture and just a few milliclips there. Putin has built up troops before. We know that. He's invaded countries before. He doesn't mind getting called to the principal's office today. What are the stakes?
Hi, Chance. We're not just talking about Ukraine's sovereignty or the stability of Europe. We're also talking about Biden's influence on the world stage and also how other countries are going to see us. Take a listen to what the former commander for U.S. Army Europe recently told me.
This is really important because the Chinese are watching this. You can be sure that the Chinese Communist Party watches. Do we actually back up what we say when we say Ukrainian sovereignty is a priority for the United States? If we don't back that up, then the Chinese Communist Party may possibly say, well, when we say Taiwan's independence is a priority, do we really mean that?
And this buildup is different than what we saw in the spring. The troops are moving more covertly, and U.S. officials say that there is an anti-Ukraine disinformation campaign that's starting to look a lot like 2014 before the Russians invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. So a lot to talk about here tonight, Chance.
Absolutely. The readout you sent around, it was pretty dry. It came from the White House. Essentially, it said, we have concerns, they have concerns, we're going to keep talking, we're going to keep working together. But as you lay out those stakes, they're very high. In the national security world where you're really plugged in, how do they see this?
Well, it's Washington, and so there's always something to argue about. And in this case, it's about the varying ways to handle the situation, not just sanctions and what kinds of sanctions, but whether there actually should be any U.S. military involvement or whether or not this is not something that U.S. troops should be sacrificing their lives for. They all recognize the threat. But as we know, Putin did say a while ago that the greatest tragedy or geopolitical tragedy, one of them, of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. And so we know that Russia has territorial ambitions. And if they aren't in any way punished for invasions and aggression, then what's to stop them, again, from doing something like this?
Sasha Ingber with the national and really global security implications as the world waits. So much discussion, and importantly, has been about Russia and the U.S., but we cannot forget about Ukraine. So let's bring in Evelyn Farkas tonight. She's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Evelyn, thanks for being here. Why does Russia consider Ukraine its domain?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Chance. Look, the reality is that Vladimir Putin thinks that Russia deserves to have a sphere of influence like the Soviet Union had over all the territories in and around Russia. And this is something that he feels very strongly about. It's an old way of looking at the world. We replaced the sphere of influence system after World War II with strict boundaries. and governments and, sovereign governments, and said that you have to respect them. When the Soviet Union fell, the world recognized Ukraine as an independent state, but Vladimir Putin now is putting out all kinds of papers and statements saying, no, Ukraine belongs to Russia. Ukraine is not a separate state, shouldn't have been recognized as a separate state. And it's just a bunch of nonsense trying to justify his troops who have seized Crimea already are conducting a war in eastern Ukraine today that has taken about 14,000 lives, and his possible new military adventures in Ukraine.
Is there any legitimacy at all to him not wanting Western troops so close? Because I was thinking the U.S. would never claim Canada as ours, but if Beijing started creeping closer and closer to that border, we'd have a problem with it.
Well, look, I think we do have troops in NATO countries stationed there, Poland, the Baltic states, and yes, that is pretty much on Russia's periphery, and Russia doesn't like it. But the reality is the reason we have those troops there has everything to do with Russia's occupation and invasion of two countries in their neighborhood. Because let's not forget that Russia is occupying about 20% of the territory of the Republic of Georgia, which it invaded in 2008 under the presidency of George W. Bush. So, and then, of course, they launched the Ukraine invasion, and there's a whole bunch of other things they've been doing, not using a full force invasion, but cyber and other tactics against neighboring states. And so these countries asked to join NATO. We have a commitment to them to defend their sovereignty as we are defending Ukraine's, but with more robust, real commitment because of the alliance.
Mm-hmm. Ukraine has been, the technicalities far better than I, but it seems like they've been informally blocked from joining NATO at this point because they've been wanting to join for many years. The president of the country is in a precarious position. How do they go about protecting their national sovereignty?
So I don't think Vladimir Putin's really afraid that Ukraine's going to get into NATO. What Vladimir Putin is afraid of is that Ukraine will become a strong democracy with a real, vibrant, free market economy. That's what Vladimir Putin's afraid of, because that's right on his border, and that is an example to the Russian people of an alternative life.
Final question, Evelyn. War looks very unlikely. Russia's economy, it's about equivalent to the GDP of Texas. So they have this outsized power globally, but financially not as much. If we do impose new sanctions, would Europe go along with us as the White House has proposed, and would it make a difference?
So Europe would go along with new sanctions, clearly. We're doing all the sanctions in lockstep. That means that probably the most painful sanctions for Russia, which would be sanctions on their oil and gas industry, on selling those products to Europe, would not be included because they are so heavily reliant on Russia for the oil and gas. But the reality is it needs to be coupled with strong assistance to Ukraine, military assistance, so the Russians know that blood will be shed if they invade again, and it will be Russian blood. And third, the international community needs to rally around the international system, which is to say that sovereign boundaries, that state boundaries matter. And just as the United Nations and all of the nations of the world condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, they need to do that again should Russia invade.
Evelyn Farkas, it is really helpful to understand this from somebody who understands and knows the region better than anyone else. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.